Hello and welcome to the Ecomodernist Society of North America, Ecomodernist Live. I'm Carl Pauls. I'm here with Gabe Bignetti, Chris Bergen, and our special guest. Tom Blees is the author of Prescription for the Planet, published in 2008. Tom founded an international science think tank called the Science Council for Global Initiatives. His work during the past 15 years has focused on workable solutions to address climate change as well as to promote energy egalitarianism around the world. Welcome to the program, Tom.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
It's great to have you. And I'm going to put that link. We've got the link to the sciencecouncil.com, and I'm going to try to put that in all of our chats right now.
Great.
Sciencecouncil.com.
The Science Council. You got to have the in the front of it.
That's what we've got. We had a great catch up behind the scenes. There's a lot of exciting stuff I think we can talk about. But let's get started by talking about this concept of energy egalitarianism. What is energy egalitarianism?
Well, it's the attempt to bring social justice to the energy sphere, to allow everybody on the planet to have abundant energy instead of just the people in the most developed countries. And it's something that is too often diminished or ignored when people talk about, how we're going to produce our energy in the future, whether it's the people that want to go all renewables or whatever. They're always essentially talking about people in developed countries. But, everybody on Earth wants to raise their standard of living, and standard of living is directly correlated with energy access. Right? So our efforts have been to find energy systems that would be applicable on a global scale and accessible to people, even to people who have very little money. And, hopefully we'll get to that point. And it's feasible to do with some of the new systems that are going to be coming online pretty soon.
So, and this is something that we kind of butt heads with on the environmental side quite frequently. What about those people, especially those in the West, who say, well, we need to do efficiency first. We need to, figure out how to do this correctly before we give energy access to 3 billion more people. What's your basic response to that?
Well, actually, I have a graph that has to do with energy efficiency and population. And it essentially shows that if you want to reach the point of energy egalitarianism, efficiency is, it'll help a little bit, but it's not going to make any difference at all. I wish I had the graph handy for you at this point, but essentially it assumes that everybody in the United States will use half as much energy as we use now, but everybody else in the world will get to use that same amount of energy. And you look at the graph and it's just like this, right? Because there's so many people that are energy poor around the world, right? So, energy efficiency is great. Just like, people that want to build a lot of wind and solar, they say it saves a lot on fuel on gas and coal. Yeah, it does. But it doesn't solve the problem, right? It doesn't produce all clean energy for everybody. It saves a little, and it's arguable how much fuel it actually saves anyway, but,
Right.
Don't have to get into
that. Yeah. So essentially what you're saying is that, the cost of eliminating poverty and providing energy equality, that far overshadows the excess consumption that we have in the global north. And that's not something that we're really ready to talk about in the environmental sphere. It is sort of like an ignored fact of life that energy results in social justice. It is a big tool in the fight for social justice. And I think it's a really great thing that you're taking the energy angle on equity. Why don't you tell us the premise and some of the highlights of your book, Prescription for the Plan?
Well, it was meant to be kind of a total solution to energy egalitarianism and energy supply and clean energy and climate change. And that's how I ended up getting involved with James Hansen, the granddaddy of climatology, because I emailed him and I said, you're always saying that this is a crisis, climate change is a crisis, but you never say what to do about it. I just wrote a book about what to do about it. Would you like to see it? And so I sent him a copy of it, and then he just went bananas about it. And he was on Charlie Rose's show a couple weeks later, and he started talking about my book, which wasn't quite published yet, right? Which drove me nuts because, I could have sold thousands of copies, right? And being a first-time author, I thought actually that you could make money selling books. I was naive at the time. But anyway, Jim really brought my book to the world because after that Charlie Rose show, he wrote this long, glowing review of my book and sent it out to his entire global email list. And then my whole life changed. And politicians and scientists started contacting me from all over the place. And because he was so well connected. At first, I thought I could maybe help start grassroots pressure on politicians. But once Hansen got involved, then all these doors started opening, and I realized, the big decisions that are going to be made about energy are going to be made by very few people and very important people. And if I can get involved with them and consult with them, it could help a lot. So we started the Science Council for Global Initiatives and got various scientists and engineers involved. And that's what I've been doing since. And so then that got me into looking at different systems, particularly nuclear systems, that could potentially be built quickly and safely and cheaply. And that led to one of the big projects I'm involved with now, which is Thorcon Energy, and also getting involved with fuel supply issues.
Chris, why don't you go ahead with your question?
It's been a while, I think almost 20 years since your book came out, but infrastructure, the way we make energy for the nation or for other nations, changes to infrastructure happen at a glacial speed, is how I would put it. So your book's still pretty relevant, I feel. Is that the way you feel about the things you wrote in your book?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, yeah, I think it's still relevant. I mean, I was hoping that by now it would be seen as kind of archaic, but yeah, alas, it's still relevant. But, there have been new developments since then that are very encouraging. I got involved with the Thorcon guys mainly because I'd been talking with Transatomic and with Kirk Sorensen, people that were into the idea of molten salt reactors. And I would always ask them, what are you going to build them out of? What are you going to make them out of? And they go, oh, there's new alloys now, they'll be great. And I go, bullshit, what do you guys know? You never built anything, right? And then I found out about Thorcon, and they had a molten salt reactor design, whereas Sorensen and Transatomic, they were trying to design a molten salt reactor, which operates at really high temperatures in a really highly corrosive environment. They were trying to make them, a design that would last 60 to 80 years. And the Thorcon guys came along and they go, well, we don't know how long it's going to last. So we know it'll last at least 4 years because they built one in Oak Ridge National Laboratory back in the 60s and it lasted over 4 years. So we'll just make ours disposable. So if it doesn't last any longer than 4 years, that's fine. We'll just build new ones. And we can still make them cheap enough that it would be really cheap. So I got involved with the founders of Thorcon and found out that, one of the things they talked about most was not about making money off of this project. And they talked a bit about climate change and how it would affect it, but their main issue was global poverty, how doing this would make a huge dent in global poverty. And the founders were both, at the time they were in their mid-70s, late 70s. Now they're in their 80s. They're not in it for the money. They're in it for the fact that it can really improve the world. So I felt very fortunate to be able to get involved with them. And now they're at the point where they can actually build it. They're in the money raising phase to build the first one now. But I used to go over to Russia a lot. I've been over there like 25 times since my book was written, because I got involved with this scientist in Russia who was the alpha dog of Russian science, so we got to be friends. And I ended up over there talking to all the executives at Rosatom before the Ukraine war went on. And I was talking to him about the Thorcon project because I thought this would be great. We can build the first one in Russia. And I had known some of these people at Rosatom for a long time. When I told them about how fast they could be built and how cheaply they could be built, they were very skeptical. But I knew some of the right people that they knew, that they respected. And so they said, well, we'd like you to come back to Moscow with the Thorcon guys, and we can talk about this. And so we did set up meetings in Moscow just before the pandemic started. And by the time we were done with those meetings, which went very well, they pretty much believed the Thorcon guys when they said they could build these things for about $1 a watt. And Jack Devaney, who was the designer of the ship, the power ship that Thorcon wants to build, he said, he always told me, he said, we can actually build them for less than $1 a watt. But he said, nobody's going to believe it, right? So he goes, well, just say $1 a watt. So after we got back, I'd been talking to some people at a pro-nuclear environmental group called the Clean Air Task Force out of Boston. And I'd gotten to know those people. We talked about the Thorcon idea, where you build the entire power plant on a ship and then you can just move it to wherever you need your electricity. They decided they would do a feasibility study to see how many of these power ships could be built, how quickly. So they did a survey of all the shipyard capacities around the world. And there's a lot of excess shipyard capacity around the world. So their conclusion after they did that was that if you use just currently unused shipyard capacity, you could build 400 gigawatts per year, which is the size of the entire global nuclear fleet, right? So they went to EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute, which is like the hub for the utility companies in the United States, right? It's based in Washington, D.C. Very credible organization. And they told them, they said, look, we can build these things so fast and for $1 a watt. And the EPRI people said, well, that sounds crazy. If that's true, then that would utterly revolutionize energy around the world. So EPRI decided that they would do a deep dive into the economics of it to see if the $1 a watt really made sense. I mean, even if it was $3 a watt, it'd still be fantastic, right? So EPRI did a deep dive into this and came up with their conclusion that you could build these ships for 80 cents to $1 a watt. So Jack was not kidding when he told me he could do it for less than $1 a watt. Okay, so at any rate, if you can do this, you could then build these ships, and countries could build them, companies could build them, Exxon could build a fleet of ships, and you could move them to wherever you want to provide energy to people. And you wouldn't have to share nuclear technology with countries that may be politically unstable, right? Because it would be all enclosed on a single ship. You would basically become a utility company, and you just plug into the grid in whatever country they need it. And all you have to have is a navigable waterway. So anywhere along the coast or anywhere up any navigable river, you could do this. So yeah, I'm pretty excited about that, and they're ready to build this. Like I say, now they're in the money raising phase, but they're ready to go. And once they get the money they need, which is not that much, they'll be able to build this in probably less than a year.
So a question that I want to follow up on is, when it comes to that export restriction, is there policy work being done, the Thorcon model?
Thorcon's been in constant contact with the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, to make sure that everybody's kind of on the same page and they know what's going on. They've been focusing on building and deploying the first ones in Indonesia, which is obviously a perfect place for a floating power plant because it's a nation of islands, right? And to some extent, myself also with them, I have been interfacing with the Indonesians for quite a few years, and pretty much everybody in the energy department, in the government, and in the utilities in Indonesia are on the same page that they want to do this now. So utility company executives in the United States, and I talked to one of them who was in charge of building the reactors in Georgia at the Vogtle power plant. And he said, "Oh man, if I could buy one of these power ships," he said, he said, "I'd do that in a heartbeat." He said, "You know what a pain in the ass it is to build a nuclear power plant?" He said, "If I could just float one in," he said, "Absolutely, I'd do it." And I had another utility company exec I was talking to, and he goes, "I'll buy the second one," So it's a matter of demonstrating, building the first one. And once you build it, you can build them really fast. They'll start out building them in South Korean shipyards because they have the most sophisticated shipyards in the world. And that's where Jack built a bunch of his ships. He designed the largest tanker in the world, built it for in 10 months for $89 million. And it worked great. And so he built 3 more. So the 4 biggest tankers in the world were Jack ships. And they were flying, they were, moving around, and they were really cheap to build. And he thought, well, if we can build them this cheap and this fast, he said, what if you could build nuclear power plants like that? And that's how they started Thor. So they got a lot of experience. I mean, these guys are accomplished industrialists. They've built tons and tons of ships and designed them. They're not a couple of kids fresh out of college or something. They're very realistic. So I think it's going to happen. But if it does happen, or if something like it happens, like if the Natrium project in Wyoming gets off the ground, which it looks like it will, and you and I were talking earlier that I'm trying to get you the fuel for it. We're going to need a lot of fuel, because we'll be building reactors really fast, and enrichment facilities in the United States are so lame that we're still buying fuel from Russia. So that's another project that I've been working on, is a way to produce lots and lots of fuel really quickly. And actually, this scientist in Russia, Belikov, he was the person who came up with the idea for the ITER project, the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor that they're building in France. That was his concept. He's a plasma physicist. We were talking about it one day, and he said, I want to build a small tokamak, a small fusion reactor. And he doesn't want to build it for power production. He wants to build it as a neutron source so that he can use it to bombard thorium to make U-233, to make fuel for reactors. And you could make a lot of it. Most of the output from a fusion reactor is neutrons, right? And we know how to make a small tokamak. So when I was last over in Moscow in late 2019, we were talking about this, and he goes, "This is great. You build the ships, I'll make the fuel, we'll be fine." And he had gotten the permission from the government to build his tokamak. So I don't know if he's been able to follow up with it, because once the pandemic hit, everything started going sideways. And then when they invaded Ukraine, which he's very distraught about, we can't do it.
So a quick note, I am employed by TerraPower working on the Natrium project, and I can't speculate or make comment on undisclosed parts of it, and I'm not a good person to be briefed on this, so I'm just going to sit back and smile and ask non-pointed questions that I know are definitely in the public area. So tell us, this project to make fuel really quickly, that uses a tokamak as a neutron source, or have I misunderstood?
No, this is one option to make fuel quickly that Velikov was working on, right? But I got involved shortly after I published the book, around 2010. I got to know a nuclear engineer who had worked on laser enrichment, and he had figured out a way to enrich uranium using lasers. Now, back in the 80s, the US built a gigantic centrifuge facility for enriching uranium. And it had, I forget how many hundreds of centrifuges. And these are big centrifuges. They're like 40, 50 feet high, right? And about the time they got it built and started operating it, some physicists were saying, this is really inefficient. This could be done with lasers. And so instead of just going ahead and using the centrifuge system while the physicists figured out how to do this with lasers, they just tore down the centrifuge facility and buried the centrifuges out in the desert. And by the time they were almost all buried, there was a guy that got into the DOE about that time and realized what a horrifically stupid thing this was. And he saved the last 15 centrifuges, which are now being employed by Centrus, which is a company that was to do fuel and laser enrichment. But it's a very inefficient way of doing it. Now, nobody was able to figure out how to do the laser thing, but there was a guy in Australia named Goldsworthy that figured out that he figured he knew how to do this. He had some people working with him. And so they developed a system called Silex to do this laser enrichment. And the French were working on it. A bunch of people were working on it, but everybody was bumping up into brick walls on the thing. I think Exxon was even involved at one point. But he had a guy who had been born in Southeast Asia in the Dutch East Indies named Jeff Irkins. And Jeff ended up being my neighbor in Northern California. And he had worked on laser enrichment, laser isotope separation quite a long time ago. And he had been working on it with the Silex guys. But he didn't get along with Goldsworthy, so he split off on his own, went up to Canada. Cameco, the big Canadian uranium company, said, we'll finance your R&D. So he went up there and he was working in Canada on the R&D. And he came up with a system that would really work. But then the Soviet Union fell apart. And the Russians had a huge amount of uranium that they wanted to sell on the market. And Cameco wanted to middleman a bunch of that uranium. And the Russians didn't want competition from laser enrichment. So they told Cameco, okay, you can middleman a bunch of our uranium, but you got to cut off your laser project. So they sent Jeff packing, and he came back to the United States. And he took all of his lasers and put them in a storage locker in this town where I was living in Northern California. So I got to know him, and he said, yeah, I got this system. It really works. And so we started a company to try and get them just, $2 or $3 million so that he could prove the project, right? And so I went over and we went over and we talked with Areva over in France, the big nuclear power company, and they were real interested. They were very impressed, and we thought that would work. But the thing is that laser enrichment would be so small that it would be a proliferation risk, right, if the technology was spread around. So the lawyers at Areva said, no, we can't do this because the U.S. will never let us export. So it's like, okay, so nothing happened. Well, anyway, finally GE hooked up with Goldsworthy, and they were going to develop the Silex system at General Electric. So they set up a team. They got a team of laser experts. And one of them, named Christo Liebenberg, he had worked on this original Silex project. He was a laser expert from South Africa. So he was managing the GLE project. And he realized that it wasn't going to scale. So he went to the heads of the project at GE, and he goes, hey, this isn't going to work. And he said they wouldn't listen to him. So he quit. Shortly thereafter, we got to know each other, and he came up to Northern California and to my house and met with Jeff, and they got along really well, and everything was fine, but there was no money to do this project, right? And then a few years ago, Jeff was given a bunch of new information about the results of his experiments at Cameco. Christo realized, hey, this really worked. We got to do this. So they started looking around for money to start a company, and I was helping them do that. And finally, they started this company, which is called Laser Isotope Separation Technologies, LIS. and we started this new company. And now, so what happened was Christo went up to Northern California where Jeff lived, set up all Jeff's old equipment, got a team of people together to do this. And now they're just moving now to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where they'll be able to access the uranium that they need so that they can move the project along. But here again is a system that's not going to take very long to prove out. Within a year or two, they're going to be able to show that this works. Basically, what they have to do is redo Jeff's experiments that he did in Canada, and then scale it up. And they're very good at it. Christo is really sharp. And so, so we're really excited about it because I think within a couple of years, we're going to be able to start. And what it's going to do is it's going to make centrifuges obsolete.
Right. And so is this, because we've previously covered laser enrichment, is this in cooperation with Silex still, or is this a competing laser enrichment?
It's a competing laser enrichment system. Yeah.
Wow.
And I don't know how much I can tell you about this.
That's all right. We understand the sensitivity.
Suffice it to say that one or two lasers using this system, it would take probably 100 lasers using the Silex system, right? So you'll be able to produce a lot of highly enriched, HALEU if you want it, 20% enriched uranium or 4% enriched uranium, really fast in a very small footprint. One of these laser setups would take about 300 or 400 square feet.
Yeah. And that's sure to be extremely, extremely tightly controlled, because remember, even that Silex process, which was 50 times less efficient, that was too powerful to avoid a non-proliferation risk. And that's
right.
That's amazing. So if the Silex process is 200 times more energy efficient, and the Livenberg new company, the LIST project system, is 50 times better than that, this is taking the carbon intensity of nuclear energy, if combined with something like seawater enrichment, seawater uranium extraction, this is taking the carbon impact of nuclear far, far lower than any other energy source. And that's even before we talk about having a breeder reactor. So this is, for all intents and purposes, actually zero carbon, because it's so little energy needed to mine and enrich the fuel.
We've got about almost 1 million tons of depleted uranium in the United States right now. And natural uranium has like 0.7% U-235. The depleted uranium still has around 2 to 4%, right?
0.2 to 0.4?
Yeah, 0.2 to 0.4%. So using the laser system, we could go through that 1 million tons and still harvest a lot of U-235 out of that. Now, the thing is that a reactor like the Natrium reactor, which is basically a GEH prism reactor, it's so efficient and it can use depleted uranium as fuel once you get it started. So it takes about a ton. I'm sure you know this, but for the listeners here, it takes about a ton of depleted uranium for a per gigawatt year of electricity that you get out of it. So if you compare this to coal, for instance, just to give you an idea of the energy density we're talking about here, we've got 1 million tons. A ton of depleted uranium is about the size of 2 milk crates. Okay. Coal-fired power plant, 1 gigawatt coal-fired power plant, to produce the same amount of energy as 2 milk crates of this depleted uranium would in a year, would take 365 train loads of coal, each about a mile long, right, to produce the same amount of energy as 2 milk crates. So if you think about that 1 million tons of depleted uranium that we have, if we would utilize it in these reactors that we know how to build, right? And if you took 4 train tracks parallel, full of train loads of coal cars, right? And you stretch them out, guess how long those 4 train tracks would be? Guess where they would reach to?
Are you going to say the moon? Is that no,
Nah,
not quite the
no.
moon? Okay.
The sun.
The sun.
Oh,
4 train loads of coal reaching from the Earth to the sun equals the energy that we have sitting there for free
Mhm.
that we can burn up in reactors like the Natrium reactor. So,
Well, yeah,
when we're talking energy density, don't even think about it. Wind,
Right.
solar, it's nuts. It's nuts. We
Yeah.
have everything. We have more than we'll ever need.
Yeah. I'm going to let Chris go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, I was just thinking about if we're going to have, it sounds like, an abundance of usable, fissionable uranium coming up in the next decade or less, then we can build lots and lots of reactors quickly, as Thorcon's wanting to do. There are already power ships existing that run on diesel or perhaps even liquefied natural gas.
Mhm.
No, Puerto Rico, I believe, has one. Lebanon's used one. So that's not a new idea, hooking up to the grid from a ship. Besides electricity, could we also, with a Thorcon model or MSR in general, fitting into industrial heat usages?
Oh
Because that's
yeah,
another large amount of power that we need.
yeah, yeah. It would work great because their operating temperature is around 700 C. So you could do most industrial processes are going to be perfectly amenable to that. Any that require higher temperatures, you could just augment the 700 C with some extra electrical heat. So you're going to be able to do, electrolysis, high heat electrolysis, which is much, much more efficient than low heat electrolysis. So there's an organization out of, I think they're based in England, and they've done, like mock-ups of one of these Thorcon power ships with electrolysis units on the deck, right? And by the way, the spent fuel from the MSRs that they would have on these Thorcon power ships, we were talking about, where we're going to put the spent fuel, and Jack just redesigned the ship and added a little more length to it, and he goes, okay, well, we can put 80 years worth of spent fuel, just leave it on the ship. Don't have to find somewhere else to put it. So that would leave you plenty of time to figure out how to recycle it, but it can all be recycled anyway using a pyroprocessing technique that I wrote about a lot in Prescription for the Planet. And I was also working on getting a pyroprocessing unit built. That's part of what we did with the Science Council. And now, finally, the Japanese are going to build one. So, we're getting there too. So the waste issues, not an issue. The fuel supply shouldn't be an issue. The reactor designs and the cost shouldn't really be an issue. And though they might not be able to do it for $1 a watt, I think the Natrium project is going to be quite economical anyway, maybe $2 or $3 a watt. I don't know. Carl, you probably can't say.
I can't say.
But you should be
Even
able
if
to
you knew.
$2 a watt. So that the Natrium project is going to be great. And I'm really glad that Bill Gates got involved in it. I almost had a chance to get together with him and talk to him about this years ago. But Yoon Chang, who is my mentor and tutor since 2001 or something, he's like probably the world's leading expert on this type of fast reactor. And he had a meeting with Bill. And I wanted to be there because Yoon's a fantastic scientist, but he's not much of a salesman. But I wasn't able to be there. But after Yoon's meeting with Bill went to Idaho National Lab and got the whole lowdown about pyroprocessing and fuel and that sort of thing, and ultimately followed up. And there are other stories that go back to the very beginnings of TerraPower when I was involved with, dealing with Nathan Mervold. But that's for personal conversation later. Kind of funny.
Wonderful. Gabe, did you have any questions?
yeah, I did. You mentioned you're talking about these super powerful lasers that could get more energy out of uranium. What about coal waste? Could they draw the fuel from coal? Because I noticed it's supposed to be so radioactive.
Yeah, I don't think it would ever be practical. I think other sources of uranium that are purer would be far, far more practical. Now the laser system can probably be tuned to separate other isotopes, and I was talking with Per Peterson about this. He's the head of Kairos, which you might be familiar with. It's another advanced reactor that's also going to be built in Oak Ridge pretty soon, actually. And they wanted to get some way to separate lithium-6 from lithium-7 because they wanted to use it in their molten salt reactor. And I believe that can be done. It's a pretty tricky and expensive process the way it's done now, and not really practical for commercialization. But I think that the laser system will probably be able to do that too, which would be great because that would open up more avenues for molten salt reactors.
Great. We've covered a lot of stuff, but let's try to rewind a bit. Are there updates or errata that you've been able to add to prescription to the planet?
Well, in that book I wrote about the idea of using boron to fuel cars, and it's something that I still think could be done. You'd have to create a whole new infrastructure, a boron recycling infrastructure and that sort of thing. So theoretically, it's a good idea. And actually, shortly after the book came out, there were scientists at Sandia National Lab who thought this was a great idea, and they were like kind of pursuing it, and it would work. Yeah, I don't know. The electric car thing, it's problematic somewhat. I mean, I got a hybrid myself, but it's problematic in the mining that is required for making the battery and some of the materials that you need to make the batteries. And there are obviously a lot of people working on new battery technologies, and hopefully some of them will work. The thing about batteries is obviously you don't need an entirely new charging infrastructure around the world, although the way they currently do it now is with putting up chargers like the Tesla chargers. In China, I think some of the companies there are getting into the idea of swappable batteries, which is an idea that's been around for quite a while, but that would probably work as well. But, and then there's the idea of powering cars with ammonia. That's, that's something that could be done without too much difficulty, I think. I mean, you can already do it.
Yeah.
People run cars and tractors and stuff with ammonia. It's a hazardous substance, probably, I would guess, maybe more hazardous than gasoline a little bit. But it's something, we know how to do. We know how to move this stuff around. We know how to make it. And again, you need a lot of hydrogen. So you got to get your hydrogen from something, right? Because it's NH3 or NH4. And so again, you get your hydrogen from electrolysis, high energy electrolysis, high temperature electrolysis that you would use with the nuclear reactors. So you wouldn't be producing any greenhouse gases. And it worked fine. And then you wouldn't have the mining issues that you have with the batteries that we have today. So, like I say, I suspect there's a pretty good chance that we'll be able to have batteries pretty soon that aren't so mining intensive. And, the thing about mining, of course, is all these big earth movers and stuff, they use diesel fuel, right? But there's a lot of them now that are using electricity, but they're not using battery. They just have a big generator at the mine site, and they run big cables to the earth movers, which works within a certain distance. But then, if you want to move further, then you got to move your generator over. It's doable, and it's being done in various places. So. Again, when you're talking about the generators that they're using, what are they burning in the generators? Some of these little micro reactors that are being developed now would be great for mining operations, where you just have a truck that has a nuclear power plant on it. All very doable.
Great.
Yeah.
Do you have any other questions? We've kind of covered the science Council, but we can go more into that unless Chris or Gabe got other questions.
I was thinking about asking more about the Science Council, but I'll just throw in that besides large construction equipment, I wouldn't mind seeing the railroads built out immensely, limiting the number of cars and trucks on the roads, which are moderately dangerous, and having a bunch of train engines run on microreactors.
Yeah.
I think if we can keep a human being safe when there's a train accident inside that engine and stuff,
Yeah.
I'm sure we can keep a microreactor safe as well.
Yeah.
But that's long term for me. But yeah, about the Science Council, what's unique about that compared to other policy and environmental groups that keeps you going with it?
I guess, it's kind of hard to say. It's been part of my existence for so long that I just feel like it's kind of part of me. But I mean,
Right.
it allowed me to reach out and get a lot of international connection, so that I was, doing consultation with, the UK and Korea, South Korea and Russia a lot, and various South Africa and all different countries, to kind of spread this idea of energy egalitarianism. It's not a big organization. It's basically me working, and we have some great advisors and board of directors, and we're able to keep connected to a lot of different aspects of energy, right? Different projects that are going on around the world. There's a guy down in Australia that's working on producing pure carbon out of carbon dioxide. There's so many different projects, so many different technologies, and it's kind of a hub for trying to keep a lot of these connected. And a lot of what I do is just connecting different people that have disparate technology projects in different parts of the world that sometimes don't know about each other. And I find out about them and hook them up. So
yeah, and there's some ideas that you championed, or maybe you were not aware anyone else had 20 years ago, and you championed these ideas. Now you're seeing them pop up in other groups, and sometimes even in government policies.
Yeah, well, the thing is that after I wrote my book, I got to know a lot of people, right, that were interested in it and interested in these ideas. Several of them got together and did a project, and they wrote it up, and they call it the Ecomodernist Manifesto, right? And I wasn't involved. I didn't even know they were doing it, right? So
Did they ask you to sign it?
well, no, nobody even told me about it. And so they came up with this Ecomodernist Manifesto, and I read it, and I go, these are all my friends, right? So I talked to Barry Brook, who was this Australian biologist who was involved with me a long time ago. And I said, Barry, how come nobody told me about this? And he was outraged. He goes, nobody told you? It's like, but you started this, it's like, whatever, it worked. Barry's doing fine, by the way. He's doing his biology down in Tasmania. He lives in Tasmania now. Yeah.
Well, I'm looking at the Science Council for Global Initiatives, and they've got a newsletter. So of course you can subscribe to the newsletter and get yet another source of interesting eco-modernist style connections. And we're very happy to see some of the projects you've got. The integral fast reactor, plasma recycling, fresh water for all, and disarmament and proliferation. Aside from sort of these keystone projects, is there an underlying something that leads you to seek out new projects and new things that you can pull people together on?
Not really. I mean, I'm just immersed in all these different things. Well, I did a project back in 2015 for a congressman in California who has been wonderful, to examine whether we could do desalination on a huge scale in California and feed it into the California water system, right? And California produces about 50 or 60% of the country's fruits and nuts and vegetables for the United States, but they're always short of water. So I did this project to figure out, okay, how many desalination plants would we need, and then how would you move the water to where you need it. About 400 miles to the north of Lake Shasta, the Columbia River is dumping vast quantities of nice fresh water into the ocean, right? So it would run a canal system down along the east side of the Cascades and dump it into Shasta Lake, and then you're fine. And also raise Shasta Dam by 200 feet because it was originally designed to be 800 feet high. But it was stopped at 600 feet because World War II came on. They needed the steel and the manpower for World War II, so they just stopped it at 600. But it's designed to be 800 feet high. And if you raise it 200 feet, you triple the volume of Lake Shasta, and you would have all the water that you would need if you keep Lake Shasta reasonably full. You'd have all the water you need for all of California and then some. So anyway, long story short, I had published this paper originally in 2015 on our website. And then just before the last winter, when they had a lot of rain in California, they had a drought for like 3 years. And some people contacted me, a guy from the National Marine Fisheries Service, somebody who was involved in water projects in California. And they had found this old paper. And I said, well, I'm just in the process of updating it. And so they asked me, yeah, please update it. This is the only thing we've seen that makes sense for California. So I updated this paper and I published the new version on our website, which you can see on our website. I forget what I call it, but just look up the water project. It's called the ORCA project, which stands for Oregon and California, right? But it's a nice Northwest thing because people like orcas up in the Northwest. But essentially, Eastern Oregon, east of the Cascades, is a desert. And it's much like the Central Valley of California. It's kind of semi-arid, mostly. And you would be able to run this water, an amount of water that wouldn't meaningfully diminish the flow of the Columbia River. You could run some down the east side of the Cascades and not only provide all the water that California would need, but you could also provide a lot of water for Eastern Oregon to make that desert bloom like the Central Valley of California and create a multi-billion-dollar agriculture industry in Oregon. California legislator friend thought it was a wonderful idea. And so he said he was going to take it to the Oregon congressman and talk to him about it. And then the next time I went to see him, I said, so what was the result? And he goes, the politics of this are so screwed up. He said, be able to see that happen.
Did he explain why? Or
the politics of it, everybody's going to want to bite out of it, right? Even if you're not pulling out enough water out of the Columbia River to make any difference downstream, Oregon's going to want money, Washington's going to want money, right? The environmentalists are going to go nuts. You know how politics is. In this country, you can't build anything anymore, right? And then not only that, but the logical way to do it would be to dump the water into the McCloud River, which runs into Lake Shasta, right? But possibly in anticipation of somebody wanting to raise the level of Shasta Dam, environmentalists got the McCloud River designated as a scenic river, a wild and scenic river, right? So you would have to rescind that wild and scenic river thing because you would raise the level and that would affect the level of the McCloud River. They tried to extend the metro system from Western Washington, D.C. to Dulles Airport, right? Mostly along the middle of a freeway, right? I mean, it's something that in China, it would have been done in probably 6 months. And it took, 15 years or something? There are too many people that are ready to sue to stop development of virtually anything in the United States. And that's one reason why I'm really glad that development of new nuclear reactors isn't limited to the United States. Because if it was, you see what happens every time.
Yeah. I wonder if it was made to involve the hydroelectric project as well, if that might do the environmentalist ire.
Yeah, well, the thing is that you would pull the water for this Orca project. You would pull it out of the Dulles Dam, out of 2 of the turbines. They have, I forget how many turbines, 18 turbines or something, right? You would take the water out of 2 of the turbines, and you would pump it down south. So it's already involved with the hydro project, right? But
it would be another target for dam breaching activists, and we have enough of those already.
Yeah, I know. It's really frustrating, but I would encourage people who just would be interested in the concept of how to solve this problem, because it also would help solve the problem of the Colorado River, because California sucks water out of the Colorado River for agriculture and for San Diego, and you wouldn't need any of that. So California could take their fairly substantial amount of water that they get from the Colorado River and say, that's fine, we don't need it anymore, which would be great. But, I don't see that happening. I see great reactors and lots of fuel happening much easier and faster than the water project. But so, like I say, I get involved with a lot of different projects. And that one is kind of special to me because I lived in California in the Central Valley, and it'd be so great. It'd be so good for everybody. It would stabilize food prices. It would create huge numbers of jobs. It would eliminate the water pumping that's dropped the ground levels in some areas of the Central Valley 30 feet or more because they're pumping out all the water. I mean, and it'd even help with forest fires, right? But anyway, read about it if you're interested.
There you go.
It was a lot, but it was worth it.
Yeah. What are your final thoughts? Final comment about the Science Council, or perhaps a new ideas you're working on. Maybe you'll publish again in the future. Anything else you want to tell us about?
Yeah, I'll publish again in the future. The thing is, I wrote the first chapter of my book, my new book, and then the second chapter, I feel like I have to deal with the nuclear versus renewable issue, which is, you almost have to, but I'm so fed up with it. And I could write a whole book about that, but I don't want to dwell on it. I want to talk about the new systems, the Thorcon project, the Natrium project, the laser project, all these other things that portend a really optimistic future, and what I think is a realistically optimistic future for the world. So eventually I'll get back to it and a new book will come out. But meanwhile, I had originally intended to write my next book after the Thorcon project, and it's taken a bit longer, unfortunately. I think I'm going to try again with the Department of Energy to get that fuel for the Natrium project that I was telling you about. Because originally the Natrium project was supposed to start up around 2028, but they were going to buy their HALEU, their 20% enriched fuel from Russia, and now they can't buy it. And so that project and the X Energy project also, which also needs some HALEU, they've been stretched out to the early 2030s because we don't have the fuel supply. So we can make the fuel supply very easily with fuel that we have available, but the NNSA, the National Nuclear Security Agency, is kind of a thorn in the side, making it more difficult. So I'm going to work on that some more. But if the laser project really cooks along as fast as I think it's going to, it probably won't be a problem anyway, because we'll probably be able to produce the fuel for the Natrium project that way, and they could get back on track. So anyway, long story short, I'm optimistic about the future. I think things can be really, really fixed on a global level in the not too distant future. And I try not to get too involved with the whole nuclear versus renewable thing, because that's just going to be noise in the end. If you demonstrate cheap, safe, and fast nuclear power plants, any utility company is going to buy them. And it won't matter if their parking lot outside their headquarters is full of Greenpeace protesters. What's ultimately going to work is the economics. If the economics work and the safety works, it's going to happen.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for your contributions. This has been the Ecomodernist Channel Live with our special guest, Tom Blees. We'll broadcast every Sunday, or just about every Sunday, at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. You can find us here on YouTube at Ecomodernist 1, the Ecomodernist Channel Live. And please support us on Patreon at the Ecomodernist Channel. You can also find rebroadcasts and mirrors of this on my personal X.com account, my LinkedIn. Those are both under Carl Alex Pauls. You can find us on twitch.tv at Soyaddle and soyaddle.tv. And remember, emissions first, peace and justice will follow.
Please subscribe to us on YouTube, Ecomodernist channel. Also to subscribe to us on Twitter and Facebook, Ecomodernist Society of North America.
And online at https://esna.earth.